And good afternoon. So welcome to the 9th session of the Spring 2019 Sunoikissis Digital Classics module. This session is on digital methods in ancient paleography. This is the penultimate session of this semester. And we're being joined by Yasmine Amory from Ghent, Isabelle Marthot-Santaniello from Basel, and Simona Stoyanova from King's. And we're going to hear various different methods and approaches, which I'm looking forward to. And so I think we'll start off by handing over to Isabelle.
Hello, everyone. Are we good?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. So we will start very briefly by a presentation of palaeography as a discipline. It could take the whole hour, so it's going to be very brief. It is often considered that palaeography started in the end of the 17th century by two key publications. The one by Mabillon, and that provides the basis of both diplomatics and palaeography. Diplomatics being the study of the structure and classification of ancient official documents, and palaeography, the study of ancient handwritings. And a couple of years later, the word palaeography appears in the book by Montfaucon, that is also founding the discipline of palaeography for the Greek scripts, and also codicology, so all aspects of ancient writings. From there, several schools developed, and the care to classify scripts according to style, according to scriptoria, and also reflecting on the criteria for this classification have developed. In the specific field of papyrology, we can see in the most ancient publication a care to provide information on the shape of the handwritings. For example, here with one of the first volume of the SPP, you can see that it is closer to a facsimile than to a real edition, really to show the shape of the letters. We have the same kinds of elements also for epigraphy, and there I leave to the specialist of epigraphy in our group.
Hello, this is Simona speaking. Let me screen share. So in epigraphy, there are a number of publications from the 19th century talking about palaeography of ancient handwriting, but it's mostly about various kinds of papyri and manuscripts. Specifically for inscriptions, there are two major studies, one on Greek, one on Latin, and understandably, because there is an uninterrupted flow of text, the Greek one focuses on Athens and the Latin one focuses on Rome. So we can see on the left side is a page from the study on Athenian masonry and stone cutting, and you can see that they give, similar to what Isabelle was just saying, they give a diplomatic sort of, a combination of diplomatic and editorial view of the text in the first half of the page, and then they describe the various characteristics of the letters line by line. On the right-hand side, we see a page of the study on Latin epigraphy, which in this case is more concerned with the planning, layout, and execution of the inscriptions. So how is an inscription actually carved? What angles do we bent the chisel to execute it, and so on and so forth. But as I say, those studies are specifically concerned with Athens and Rome. For the provinces, more marginal places in the empire, the palaeography is tends to be a bit messier because it's subjected to various influences and different types of quality of the stone, which also has bearing on the matter. And now I pass on the microphone.
Hi, I'm Yasmine. I will talk a little bit about the background of palaeography and the methodology. I'm a Greek papyrologist, so my approach is mainly a papyrological one. But since when we deal with palaeography, we deal with the same questions, we should be fine. So let me share also the screen. So about the background, we have a little problematic when we talk about palaeography and papyrology, because papyrologists, to quote Rodniast, traditionally privileged the content of the text itself over external features such as hands. So we don't have a lot of paleographical annotations in editions. Of course, there are some, but especially in the first editions, they're very rare, and the handskrifts are rarely annotated also. And the second problem is that paleography was mainly considered as an art, not as a science, something really subjective. So for these reasons, we don't really have a paleographical approach to papyrology, and it is a quite new discipline, let's say. And this reflects also, of course, when you do have to deal with a text, and so we do not have a very specific typology or a very specific terminology on paleography when we deal with documentary or literary papyri. So we have some overviews of the evolutions of the handwriting, and the study of Guglielmo Cavallo are very important in this field, and it shows the evolutions of the handwriting in papyri and in literary and documentary texts, and it shows how every change of the handwriting are significant because are signs of changes of the society and of the socio-cultural milieu. And as I was saying, there's a problem with the terminology. So we have some attempts to define a terminology of paleography, like the one from Bataille with the Pour une terminologie en paléographie grecque in the 50s, but actually nobody uses this terminology. So if you use Bataille's terminology, nobody will understand you because nobody uses it. So we have some methodological problematics when we are dealing with paleography and papyrology. Of course, when we deal with a text, we have to consider some very common and very general questions, but very important ones. So what is in a text? What is the text about? When was it written? Where? How? Who wrote it? And why? Of course. And so what is the text itself? Who needs to be read? Maybe from a different script that we use and deciphered. When is the period of the document? Where is the area or the place where the document was written? How involves the technique, the instrument, and the different materials? And who concerns, of course, the person who wrote it and his milieu. We call it more generically, more broadly, a scribe. Not referring to a professional milieu, but just the person who writes a document. And I try to translate the 6 categories of persons who can write a document. They are translated from the categorization made by Arnaldo Petrucci, an Italian paleographer. So we pass by the cultured writers. The first one were people who could master different writing and different languages, and who have very high competencies in reading and writing, and we go through the illiterates who weren't be able to read and write it, but this doesn't mean that they didn't receive an education. And they use mainly oral and visual communication. And the last question we answer when we deal with a text is why, the purpose. So I give back the word to Isabelle.
Thank you. So you would have understand from what has been said that the situation the paleographers has to face is very complex, and so quite naturally the field has divided according to languages. So you would have the Latin paleography, Greek paleography, Arabic, Hebrew, and also from the kind of material that you are dealing with, the most relevant vocabulary needs to be chosen and spread. But the question of how much an handwriting is individual also appears, and what should you take as a model and what should you take as a variant. So this is one of the problems that have been the specialists have been dealing with, and a solution to this is the appearance and the production of albums. So many of the paleographies are examples with precise text that are quoted, rather than a real list of scripts and styles. And of course, the case of Egyptology shows how much interconnection there are in the field. So people working on papyrus would have a certain element in common, whether the text is in hieratic, demotic, Coptic, or Greek. But this is also the same kind of weak boundary that you can find between papyrology and epigraphy. For example, the most ancient papyri have a script that is obviously inspired by epigraphy. So we can talk about an epigraphic style in papyri. And we also have some inscriptions that are in the middle, like graffiti. Would graffiti belong to epigraphy or papyrology? That is something that is not obvious, and that depends case to case. So adaptation to the situation, and a complex situation, is really the main keyword in this field. And I leave the stage to my colleagues for examples.
Thank you. So I'll just show you briefly. Again, sorry, I'm not really used to do it. I'm just show you briefly an example with this bilingual scribe from 6th century Egypt. During my PhD, I could identify a bilingual scribe who was writing letters in Greek and in Coptic. This is a detail from a Greek letter of his hand, and this is the Coptic, a Coptic letter from this hand too. So, of course, the paleographical analysis was crucial, because even if the handwriting were not the same, because every language is subject to formal conventions, graphic conventions, we can see that is the same hand, because it has some Greek ligatures that he's doing in his Greek handwriting, like the D here, or the epsilon rho, which is called as the peak technically. We can find it also in the Coptic handwriting, like here or here. And this is show how the scribe was very confident in both the handwriting and how scriptural conventions can also influence and can also be translated into in our language and in our script. So this was just a brief example. I pass to Simona.
And for an example from epigraphy, we have a similar situation to what Isabelle and Yasmine were saying. So sometimes, like in the first example to the left, we have deliberate bilingual execution, and there's a difference between the top bit, which is in Latin, and the bottom bit, which is in Greek. And in this case, the scribe absolutely deliberately, excuse me, used a completely different style of writing to differentiate between the two two parts of the text. They are more or less a translation of each other with some differences. But in this case, this is an inscription commemorating the building of walls of a city. So the Latin part is necessary to show that this is a part of the Roman Empire, and the city walls were built following the Roman administration. However, this is a city with Hellenistic type administration and quite likes their independence. So the bottom bit is in Greek, the letters are wider, more visible, etc. So sometimes the choice of language and the choice of script follows political and ideological reasons as well. In the second example, we see something which is similar to bookhand, but on a stone. So the ligature of Omicron and Upsilon representing the U diphthong, that normally happens not on stone, but elsewhere in other types of material. And the upside down omega as well is a sign of influence of bookhands on this particular stone cutter. And the third example I put as a mixture of language and alphabet, because the inscription is written in Greek alphabet, but when you read it, it's actually in Latin, which I find quite hilarious. So as I said, as Isabelle said in the beginning, the mixture of languages and scripts and alphabets can be quite complex, and it varies a lot depending on the region, on the genre of text, on the type of material, on the competency and literacy of the scribe or the commissioner or both. So we have to consider all of these things when we approach any palaeographical research. And now I pass back to Yasmine.
Thank you. Of course, the formal analysis, the physical analysis of the object is very important, and is the first approach that that we're going to use. But very recently, we also there was also a new approach that we are using, is the semantic one. So the handwriting is no more, or at least less, considered as a secondary element, and we could finally understand that handwriting could also transmit indirect social messages concerning hierarchy, status, and power relations. And the handwriting can reveal, for example, the function of a document even before the contents themselves. That is why it is so important to analyze that. So I'll show you a practical example with Dioscorus of Aphrodito from the 6th century. We are in Egypt, in the not so little village of Aphrodito, and Dioscorus of Aphrodito is the main character from the biggest archive that we have from Byzantine age for papyrological archives in Egypt. And we have a lot of documents written by his hand, and we see that there's the literary hand here, and it's a majuscule one, more with more space, with more breathing handwriting, let's say, more clear. And then there's the documentary handwriting, this one, which is more legaturate and more quadrilinear or quadrilinear ones, and the latter, yes, are more legaturate and more close to each other. So we would expect that he use for documentary texts his documentary hands, and for literary texts his literary handwriting. But it's not always the case, or at least it is more complicated, a little bit more complicated than this. So here is a detail of a very big rotulus, a very big papyrus, which contains a petition and 3 letters. These documents are written by Dioscorus of Aphrodito, and the 2 letters are documentary letters, but are written in the literary hand of Dioscorus. That is why. This is because Dioscorus is copying a little personal anthology for himself. He's copying these letters because they are quoting Homerus, and they are very rich for a rhetoric style. So he wants a copy for himself, and he wants to elevate the letters from a documentary genre to the literary one. So that's why he chose to write them in his literary hands. So the analysis of the handwriting gives us very first signals about the nature of the documents. And since nowadays, the first approaches to digital palaeography and papyrology respect the first attempts to apply paleography to papyrology. What they mean is that they are mainly linked to provide terms of comparison for dating and maybe for deciphering papyrus handwriting. So we have a very, I'll show you an example. We have a very useful tool, which is papal paleography in papyrology, and it shows through centuries the handwriting of papyri with images. It takes a little bit to, okay. So it shows images of papyri through centuries, and only papyri that we can precisely date. So it goes on, and it is useful if we want to show, we want to see the evolution of the handwriting, and also if we have an unpublished fragment and we do not know the date of the fragment, and by the comparison of the handwriting we can try to date the unpublished fragments. So it is a useful tool, but my colleagues will show you that we are making progress in digital paleography, and we are reaching new goals, let's say. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we delve into the digital approaches to paleography, first we need digital objects with which to do our further research in paleography. And how does that happen? The first step is, of course, digitization, which has evolved quite rapidly recently. And there are several approaches. This is a list of just 3 for the moment, depending on the material and research questions and technology available. There are various ways of imaging a manuscript page or an inscription or an ostracon or whatever the support material might be. But let's have a quick run through those 3 that we've chosen for today's class. The first one is called RTI, and what it does is capture the surface, and if there is color, also the color of the surface of our material. And there is a stationary camera fixed, so it obviously does not move, and the light is projected by different directions, different known directions, and then the resulting images, usually about 80 images, are run through an algorithm which creates a pseudo model of the object. Following this, we can use the RTI viewer to interactively relight the object from various angles to make it more visible. And there is a way of documenting each and every manipulation we do in the viewer to add to the documentation of our project. So that's one approach. Another possibility is multispectral imaging, which is really useful if the surface of the object is faded and for some reason or other, usually a chemical reason, the ink cannot be read with the naked eye. So there is some manipulation necessary in this case. And depending on the type of ink, there are various different lights which can interact with the object to produce visible writing. A third possibility is X-ray computer tomography, which runs through the object and creates slices, which are again put together by an algorithm to produce a 3D model, which can then be flattened onto a 2D plane so that the text could be read. And that's the approach taken for the Herculaneum papyri, which are all charred so they cannot be unraveled physically. So once we have taken our images, we can then do various things with them. We can either process them or we can annotate them, or a bit of both. And again, for this class, we give you a few examples. I'm sure you can find more online, but for the purposes of this, one of the largest humanities-centered automated recognition projects is called Transcribus, which offers layout analysis and optical character recognition, allows for transcription, various search options, and it's also a training program. So you can load a number of images and start training the program to help you later on with automatic recognition rather than manual. Script Analyzer has a different approach. In this case, the images of various letter forms are uploaded and the background is made completely white so that the ink is contrasts the background, which enables a Script Analyzer to convert this letter shape into a computational representation, which can then be segmented, rotated, etc., to allow for further analysis. Another approach, which, as I said, doesn't involve image processing, but rather image annotation, can be seen in the project Ancient Lives, which Isabelle is going to introduce briefly in a minute, and also Archetype, which I will be talking about a bit later today, and also the Digital Map project, which allows for image annotation, text transcription, and also linking the image to its text transcription to provide more clarity. And with this, I give the floor when I stop screen sharing.
Can you see my screen? Okay. So in the question, once you have the images, once you have improved the images thanks to processing, is to annotate them. So there have been a lot of projects doing this. Some have disappeared without really leaving results. So, and others are running right now, but that's a field that is really under questions. What I would wanted to show you right now is an initiative that has been out between 2014 and 2016, a bit earlier, and that is currently under relaunch for a better adaptation to the new technology. And that's also an issue when you develop something and 5 years later you need to redo it. It can be problematic. And so this project is called Ancient Lives. It is part of the Zooniverse project, that is a very wide platform which hosts a crowdsourcing project. So the idea is that any user of internet can contribute to science by very small but important tasks once they are repeated hundreds and thousands of times. And so you can see from this screenshot that hundreds of thousands images of papyri from Oxyrhynchus, that is said to have 500,000 papyri in the collection, were put online, and the user could click on the image and assign a transcription. So that was one of the first attempt to really annotate papyrus images. And since the technology has evolved, now we are dealing with a new way of displaying images and of displaying and of annotating them, and that's the IIIF format. I'd like to show you. Here it is. So this is an example from the Bodmer library, and you see the IIIF viewer allows you to scroll among all the pictures of a same roll. And then once you have it, you can zoom in. And IIIF is also a syntax that allows you to address specific size of images, color of images, definition, or area. So that's a very promising tool for image annotation. And that's what I wanted to say about this. So I leave the hand again.
Thank you. So what do we annotate our nice and clear digital images with? So the core of paleographic research is conceptual modeling, meaning to be able to describe and then later compare different handwritings, or the same, assuming the same handwriting of the same scribe, or for any kind of comparison, we need first to decompose the script that we have, to formalize it, and so that then we can describe it consistently and compare it. So the first step is to formalize the composition of our script, meaning to decide which are the ontographs, so what shape represents the notion of each character, what components and features a character has to have to be recognized as this character, and comparing to that, which are the various allographs that are possible of this character in the material that we have. And then we structure our descriptions of each letter form in terms of components. So components are elements of the letter form which cannot be absent. They have to be there for this letter to be recognized as this letter. And features which features of those components, which can vary greatly depending on the script and material in hand. Depending on the research, we may or may not be concerned about the ductus of the writing, and that's usually measured using analysis of the pressure put on the material by the stylus and the direction of the hand of the scribe while inscribing the object. As I say, the approach, this is the basis of the paleographic research. Which components of this methodology are used and how they are combined depend very much on the discipline, on the language, on the material, on the research questions, also on what is available for us to see and analyze. What does the use of technology change then? Does it change our basic paleographic methodology? I would argue that yes, it does, because several things that technology gives us is automation, which can be problematic, but can also save a lot of time. It allows us to explain everything quite explicitly. It actually forces us to do this, which I think is an improvement on occasionally very fuzzy humanities descriptions and statements. It allows for consistency, which again, computers are way better at that than humans. And it provides us with various possibilities for visualizing our research while we're doing it, which can allow us to identify gaps in our material or in our process or in our statements. And on the other hand, visualization can also be used for representing our results. So there's various ways of using visualization during the process of our research before we go into publication. All of those considerations change our paleographic methodology because they put the emphasis on different parts of the research process in comparison to doing it in an analog environment. And the use of technology means that the paleographer has to be aware of all of those things and has to perform tasks that a paleographer 100 years ago didn't have to necessarily understand and perform, which then leads us to asking different research questions, spending more time during doing different kinds of research than some of our predecessors in the field used to do. So using technology is not using a tool necessarily. The tools help us, but they also change the way we approach our research and lead us to do research both on the paleographical but also on the digital side of things. And with this, I briefly pass back to Isabelle.
Thank you. So up. So as you would have guessed and deduced from what has been said, the digital paleography is not traditional paleography plus a computer. It is really a new way to access, to share, and to question the documents. And with all these questions, we need also to think about new way of communication, of sharing not only the documents, but the methodology, and try to avoid what Yasmine has mentioned for Professor Bataille. So someone trying very hard to produce standards and no one following that. What an important element also is the teaching material. So while working, scholars can also put online the material they're working on, and the students can learn, for example, ancient Greek from the original text that was very much more difficult in the previous past. and I'm not sure.
That's me.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think it's important to point out that using digital environment for analysis and digital technology for imaging, research, recording, publishing, everything is not necessarily a panacea for everything. And we have to be aware of the various considerations that come with the use of any methodology, in this case, various bits of digital methodologies. So some of the things that we need to think about, okay, we talked about taking images and how brilliant this is and how much it makes our research easier, but it's not always possible first to find the materials that you want to image, depending on the archive, the library, they could be lost, etc. Secondly, even if you do find images taken previously, they're not necessarily out of copyright. You would not be necessarily allowed to publish them or use them for research. So that's another thing to think about. If you decide to take your own images, that's a further set of negotiating with museums, libraries, archives, or going into the field and doing that on your own, which leads us to the second point, which is the technology. Meaning that the hardware, the software necessary for taking those brilliant high-quality images may not be necessarily easy to obtain or cheap to obtain. So that's another thing to think about. Then, of course, we come to the skills. So can we hire somebody who already has the skills? Can we go and train ourselves just on our own? Can we go to a workshop or some kind of training event? All of this costs, obviously. So when setting up a project, we need to very carefully think about what skills are needed and how we can obtain them ourselves, or which would be the people to hire potentially to involve in our team. Which leads us to the next point, interdisciplinarity. So we've all seen that we deal with various kinds of texts and languages. We jump between palaeography and typology and epigraphy. And as my colleagues were saying, the boundaries are not very clear, not always anyway. And we work together, which is brilliant. But also, it's important to recognize that different disciplines have different practices of research, practices of dissemination of research. So when we collaborate, we need to make sure that we understand each other, that we understand what our respective disciplines expect and how to deal with that. And we already talked about the digital becoming part of the research of palaeography, so I will skip that and pass to Isabelle once again.
Thank you. So since we have mentioned the difficulty of the field, I think it would be good to give now 2 examples of projects. The first one, it's in fact several projects that concern the Cairo Geniza. So a Geniza is a storeroom where documents bearing the name of God in Hebrew were kept because they were not allowed to be destroyed. And this specific Geniza is located in Old Cairo, and in the end of the 19th century, more than 350,000 documents were found, mostly from the 10th to the 13th century. So with this huge amount of data, digital solutions were needed very fast from scholars. And what is striking with the Geniza is that they combined several approaches, digital approaches. And we have now studies on different aspects of the palaeography. And I will show you examples. So, no. So on this main website, you can look for manuscript according to collections and type, but also you could look for author and for domains. You can scroll down the many documents. So I would invite you to have a look at this. And for those who were very disappointed by Ancient Lives not running, you can have a look at this other Zooniverse website that is also based on crowdsourcing. So citizen science, anyone can contribute. And you can help by saying anything about these documents. Anything that you see is recorded. Of course, if you can read Arabic or Hebrew, and you can transliterate, transcribe, or translate, it is very welcome. But if only you see that there are lines and you give the number of lines, or there are page numbers, that is also very welcome. So these are two elements that are open to public, that are useful for anyone. And of course, there have been also scholar research, so cluster of documents according to their layout. Strong work on descriptors of letters, you see, in how can we describe the typical core of letters. And what is also very impressive is here, and the approach is to look for similar shapes. So really like a jigsaw puzzle. The computer looks for breaks in the documents and join automatically fragments. The work on palaeography strictly has also been a pioneer in this corpus with the question, the field of clustering letters and automatically clustering letters, and they also have developed word spotting. So keywords that are quasi automatically recognized by the computer. And by seeing all this achievement from the Geniza project, I started to think how this could be applied to Greek papyrology. And I have very recently started a project on the Greek and Coptic palaeography, digital palaeography of Greek and Coptic papyri. So the project is still at its beginning. It will run for 4 years, and it will focus on 3 case studies. The first one is the Iliad of Homer. The second is the Dioscorus archive that Yasmine already mentioned and showed you a couple of his wealthness. And the third one is the Papas archive, that is a very difficult one with lots of very small fragments. This archive was found in a jar, and all these fragments were broken at the bottom of the jar. So I will just quickly develop a couple of approaches on the Homer Iliad. So this is the book of antiquity. Of course, that's the one that we have the most numerous testimonies. we have 1,500 fragments of Iliad that have been preserved on papyrus, and they span the whole millennium of papyrology from the 3rd century BC to the 7th century AD. And of course, they testify that they show a wide variety of scripts that the Greek script has evolved, and different styles in their handwriting. So the approach is to classify these fragments by similarity, and to put them online so that we can discuss how to label them, how to label the script, how to label the shape of the letters, in order to have a rational palaeography and give chronological evidence as much as we can. So right now, with this first 6 months, we are facing the hard question of binarization, because papyrus, as opposed to medieval manuscripts that are written on white paper, papyrus has a very dense background that the computer may be puzzled with this background, confusing breaks with letters or holes or ink, at the opposite, ink that has been erased. So we are considering right now several ways to binarize the papyri the most efficiently. And once we have the binarization, we can start classify them by similarities. The other approach that we have been starting with is on the Dioscorus archive, so 700 texts from a village in the 6th century. And many of these texts are signed. So we can have samples of the same writers over different documents. Some are not signed, but Yasmine showed how traditional paleography managed to identify them. And so in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Manuscript Culture in Hamburg, we are investigating a way to compare automatically the handwritings by their similarity, not even by binarization or by using the transcription, but really the look, the rhythm almost of the handwriting. So the work is in process, so I cannot show you, unfortunately, images from papyri, but you have the example from Latin manuscript. And so we have sorted 15 notaries, and we are now adjusting the parameters so that we can ask the computer, this contract, which notary is the most similar to any given contract. So that's the state where we are now. And I leave it to Simona for further examples.
Right. I will show you the approach taken by the Archetype suite, which I use for my PhD. So the Archetype suite is developed at King's College London, and it's based on its predecessor called DigiPal, the digital framework for ancient paleography, for paleography and diplomatic. So Archetype is an open source web-based suite of tools. It combines images with structured descriptions of letter forms, also caters for descriptions of iconography. The model is generalized, which means that it allows the study of different alphabets and handwriting on different materials. And it's currently being used for Old English, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, both in manuscript form and on coins and inscriptions, and as I mentioned, the iconography as well. One really nice thing about Archetype is it can be used for an individual piece of research, the way I'm currently using it, or it can be used within a larger project by a group of people. It offers a data model for the structured description of handwriting and decoration, meaning that the paleographer who knows their material really well defines a list of elements, components, features of letter forms which describe their material as best as possible, but it also means that the paleographer categorizes those components and features depending on what's recognizable and expected terminology within their own field. So Archetype is not proposing a general paleographic vocabulary by any means. On the contrary, it offers paleographers the opportunity to devise their own categorization depending on their material and discipline, with which then they can annotate their images and make comparisons. It also offers a text editor for transcription and translation, which happens directly in TEI XML, which allows then for export of these transcriptions and translations separately if needed for some kind of textual research later on. And I will not go through all of these points because I will illustrate them briefly now. So this is what the structured descriptions part of the framework looks like. This is the back end of the program, not the website look, which I'll show you in a minute. So what happens here is that we have identified that the letter A, in this case alpha, has several components, is composed by several different things. One component is an apex, another is a crossbar, component 3 is a left diagonal, and component 4 is the right diagonal of the character. And then each of these components may have various features. So in this case, we pick the component we want to describe further, the crossbar, and from a list of features, we pick the ones relevant for component crossbar. And in this example, we have 6 features which describe, as you can see, in great detail, the crossbar of this alpha. So this is the way the structured vocabulary works. Once we have completed our structured categorization of components and features, we can then proceed to annotate our images. And this view is from the front end, so from the website view of the framework. What happens is we load our image as high resolution as we can manage. We draw boxes around the characters we want to describe. And then from the drop down here at the top, we pick the language. In my case, I have both Greek and Latin, so I have to pick the language. In other cases, you'd be working only in one language, so you would go straight to the box with the characters. So we pick the character we are annotating, and then this box appears, which contains those previously defined components and features, and then we proceed to tick the ones relevant for this letter shape. This is the annotation process in Archetype. Once we have done this, we can then explore our graphs like this. So we can decide to display all of our alphas and to see what's the distribution by place or by date, which repositories, what they look like, to compare the ones with a straight crossbar with the ones with a broken crossbar, and so on and so forth. So Archetype provides various types of visualization depending on the research we want to do. Another feature is manipulation. So as I mentioned, Archetype doesn't process images. We annotate the images manually, but what it allows us is to compare, in this case, by superimposing one graph on top of another graph, again manipulating opacity, brightness, size, etc. of the images, which again, depending on the needs of the project, you may or may not need, but it's a really useful way of comparing various characters in a more visual way than we can do with paper photographs, for example. And the last thing I wanted to show you is that once we have done our research and collected graphs in groups and collections, we can export that, we can link those and share our collections and our research by having a URL of each of those collections. So we can, before we publish the entire thing, we can point people to bits and pieces of our research for reference, for examples, for consultation, depending on our needs. Okay, so that was the approach that Archetype takes, and now I pass back to...
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. So, what are the new the points that are proved to be important in this new research that are currently led? Of course, the drive for consistency. I think it has been clear from what has been said before. Consistency in one's own project, and then the shared terminology. So that is a general trend on internet and new program to have a controlled vocabulary to when building databases and new project, using always the same code or using unique identifier. And that's something that needs to be developed in the future for digital paleography. To reach this element, very recently funded group of research, the GORDIPAL, Group of Research on Digital Paleography, will try to gather and to reach agreements on this text. And one direction that can be taken is to suggest a new classifier, new descriptor in the TEI, Text Encoding Initiative, that would be directly relevant to paleography, like the several descriptors that Simona has just shown. And we can also be inspired by what has been done for printed fonts. And there is this PANOS, that is also a group of categories to describe printed fonts, that whatever the script, whatever the alphabet. So really the shape of the characters. Then what appears also obvious is the need for transparency. And that means that we, from the humanities, we need to change our way of dealing with sources. Until now, sources were usually books, printed books, so everyone has access to this. But now that we are calculating on images with algorithm, that we are processing the images, we need, for a scientific point of view, to provide the raw material, the raw data from which our algorithm were taken, like the results were taken. So in the future, we would probably edit papyri by providing not only the color picture, but also the infrared, if it was useful to have the infrared, and maybe also to explain what length of infrared we were using, what definition of the image we were using, what processing we have been doing on this document. So this implies for us to have a methodology that is more like natural sciences methodology, and also to think about depositories for this kind of elements of data. What is in current development also is the virtual libraries and the websites that are linking text and images. And I will just show you an example, and then I will also leave Yasmine show her project. So just to leave the Greek world for Greco-Coptic world for one moment, this is a very nice initiative on cuneiform, and you can see that the website combines metadata, images, and transcription. And of course, in the future, there will probably be the link between the image and the transcription. But already displaying all this in a new way for a virtual library. And Yasmine may want to say a word?
Yes, sure. I'll show briefly the every database. What did I do? Sorry. Okay, sorry. And so I'm part of the ERC project Everyday Writing in Greek, Roman, and late Antique Egypt at Ghent University. And we are building a database of papyri, and we want to annotate papyri also with under linguistic aspects. So we have here, there's going to be the metadata, the persons, the archive, and then the linguistic part for morphology, orthography, and typography. And we call it typography with a modern linguistic term, but it is palaeography, of course. So it consists of a virtual library, of course, because we're collecting thousands and thousands of images, but also we try to not disperse the information. So we have the text right here and the image of the papyrus here, and then the paleographical annotation are going to be filled right there. So we have the dimension, the margins, some information about the lines, diacritic signs and symbols, and information about the script. This terminology has to be modified. It is, of course, a database in progress. I'm showing you the archetype, let's say. But what we are trying to do is to have all the information in the same database. And also what I would love to do in the future is to link the information with the images. So maybe clicking on the image, you have the information if you mark a spot, or if you want to see what's going on with in a certain point, you can see the information that you need directly on the images. So let's see, maybe in a couple of years, maybe 4, we'll see how far we arrived. Thank you. I'll pass the floor to Simona or Isabelle.
Yes, thank you. Is it okay? So in the future, we would first need more material, so more digitization of papyri, of ancient documents, but this should go along with a reflection on best practice. So more and more institutions have fundings to digitize their documents, but it would be nice to think about what kind of digitization we want, the resolution, the format, the display. Should we, for example, already take infrared pictures and ultraviolet for manuscript, and what kind of infrared? So this means a discussion between the scholars, the curators of the collection, and the specialists of digital images that are often the digital labs or coming from scientific photography. And so more and more exchange in this field is needed, and publication also of previous experience of digitization that is not often done in our field. And then there is the question of the evolution of computer sciences that are is such a speed rate. We have been living the revolution of machine learning, and we're still in it. And so the need to adapt the algorithm, to develop quick, to publish quick, that is something that is a bit new in our field of humanities, and to be aware of what everybody is doing is very important. And in front of all these possibilities, the question is also, what do we really want to do? What do we want to measure? What do we want to digitize? What do we want to annotate? And this is also really not an obvious answers in the field. For example, you may try to find similarities between handwritings, and in fact, you're measuring similarities between pictures. So because the picture is in black and white, it makes a big difference compared to a colored picture. Or two pictures were taken in the same collection, and so they have similar points, even if the papyrus, the two papyri are not similar. So always we need to have a very critical eye on the results provided by the computer, not to be naive. And sometimes it's difficult because the new technology, for example, the neural network technology, provides raw results without really explaining these results. And that's something we have to deal with and to be aware of. The reflection on the publication platforms, and then we have seen a lot of examples, but until now, the work that is implied in contributing to this platform is not recognized on the CV or for job committee as much as an article, a traditional article. So this also needs to change, because we invest a lot of time, and we can see that is really something we have to do, that is obvious to do, but it is not recognized yet. And that needs to be thought about. And while talking about the future, the question of sustainability is obvious. So many projects are funded with a limited time, within a limited time. And what happens when the funding runs out and the project is stopped and the scholars move to something else? So more and more there are reflections on this point. And for example, there are initiatives to think about permanent repositories and updating. And for example, in the Swiss community, now the Swiss National Fund asks the researcher to include a reflection of what is going on after that project, right from the beginning, right from the research proposal. But this is also a very new field, and it can be quite surprising for the scholars to think about what will be the evolution of computer sciences in 10 years. And maybe, Simona, you wanted to conclude with something about libraries?
Yes, I wanted just to mention that one of the options for sustainability is repositories of the institution where the project is hosted, or a library. However, there are a number of problems. So some institutional repositories are not completely open access, and if we want to publish open access, that's not always necessarily allowed, or not, access is not available from every point in the world, depending on various, laws in countries about internet access and all of that. The other possibility would be hosting digital projects in libraries, but again, not every library is ready to do that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of server space, in terms of collaborations and relationships with the various institutions. So there are several possibilities, but there isn't one clear way to do it. And that would depend on the country and the institution and the project. But I just wanted to point out that an institutional repository is one of the options. A library repository is another of the options for longer term sustainability after researchers have left, found new jobs, the project is finished, etc. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you, yeah. Was there anything anyone wanted to say or add at this point?
No, I think we can open for questions. Yeah.
So Maria had a question earlier, sort of midway through, that she noted in the comments so as not to forget it. Do you want to ask that now, Maria, or shall I read it
out? Well, sorry, my voice is a bit down. Yeah, I was just wondering about some of this is, well, this continues maybe the question of sustainability and what happens with the projects. About the Ancient Lives project that Isa was showing. I was wondering, because I was showing it to the students and it was fun to play with that, and we were wondering that it doesn't say anywhere on the site what happens with the information. So do they actually state this somewhere, and do they have results somewhere?
Thank you, Maria. So there have been some results that are published, but mainly on the field of computer science. So it was really a key project for crowdsourcing and citizen science. And there have been a couple of articles on how to deal with the results coming from from anybody. So like the majority vote or the dealing with approximations. So the algorithm that was behind the transcriptions. So you remember you could have little round with the letters, and then we have is produced majority transcription, and this majority transcription then goes through an algorithm that is inspired by DNA research and that can deal with approximation, which is very good for papyrology because a letter can be missing, a scribe can have written with a mistake, or a different, not a mistake, but for example, diphthong like A instead of just I. So that gave quite good results to spot known literary texts. For the rest, and to answer specifically your question about what can we see on internet, the project has not officially been finished. It is in the state of relaunching, but unfortunately for a couple of years now, so it's quite scaring. But that's why there was no conclusion officially, because the whole team was expecting and hoping that the phoenix will rebirth, will come out of the ashes again. And there are still some hopes, but the main problem is the configuration of the team and the leaders that had to go away and to move to other research projects. So we still hope that Ancient Life will come out, and it has definitely been very successful for the teaching side. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind, that crowdsourcing is really a very nice way to open our disciplines to anyone, to reach out. And we had wonderful contributors that were really passionate, and that at the end that were very good readers. So that's something we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I know there's been some discomfort in some circles about just how much the Ancient Lives data set is opaque to other people. I mean, they've clearly got vast amounts of data, and it would be really interesting to open up that data and let other people play with it in new ways. But they want to, they want to feel they have something stable to release before they do so. So there's been a lot of people waiting quite a long time to get under the hood of that. Any other questions? I have one question. Again, a couple of you talked about the terminologies and the those elements of individual characters or of hands in general that are worth that we're interested in annotating or in describing. And Simona, you showed how in Archetype, the individual user, the individual project can define those terms that they're interested in for their hand, for their script, for their language. And Isa talked a little bit about the Gordipal approach to trying to find common vocabularies. And I wondered to what degree we, any of us, thought it was actually possible to have common vocabularies, common descriptors, common feature lists for ancient paleography generally, given the vast differences in the types of scripts we're talking about. I mean, there'll be some kind of similarities, presumably at one end. We can all talk about, uprights and various other things and serifs, but at the other end, there'll be so many differences. To what degree is it useful to try to come up with common vocabularies and common feature lists, as Isa was suggesting and Gordipal is looking at? Anybody?
I'm not too familiar yet with Gordipal, but from my kind of point of view and dabbling with paleography, I would say that depends on what we're trying to compare in the end. So if I'm comparing Coptic to Sanskrit, I can't really have too many common paleographical features to say, show me this character and try to. But for Greek and Latin, for example, I could at least try to call a crossbar always. So I'd say that at least an attempt at suggesting terms in various languages which are most common, most clear, most useful, maybe suggesting a list of them rather than trying to codify one set, which is never going to work anyway, and it's not the goal, I don't think. But from the various words and terms used for the same thing, even within one publication of one author, right, to be able to actually compare things and teach paleography with some clarity to the students, right, some systemization might not be a bad idea, I think. But about Gordipal, I don't really know much, so I'll leave that to Isabelle.
Thank you. Gordipal is still a a baby project. So we will have the first meetings and hopefully the first visibility online that we don't have yet in this coming month. But I totally agree with what Simona says, and of course there are some points that we will not find common vocabulary, but I think providing a list and also providing images of what we mean behind the words is really a key element. And that goes also with the transparency. Now we have the tools to have really references online that we can all turn to. And this is something that is already really worth. And then by creating the opportunity to discuss, we can discuss between Sanskrit people and Coptic people about what is a cursive writing, what is a chancery writing, or also the way, not only the writing, but the style or like I have in mind the opposition between eighth and width, for example, or the aim to reach regularity and with all the characters in one square. These are elements that are more about aesthetics or readability in the other side. So I think it can be very interesting to have possibility to exchange on a wide level, on a high level with anyone working on handwritings, and then also divide it into smaller groups like the one on Greek and talking between epigraphists and papyrologists, but also all the people working on ostraka that have specific elements, whatever the script. So that's really the goal of Gordipal, to allow exchange on ways that are not obvious from traditional disciplines.
That would be fantastic also, not just for the paleographers, but also for teaching the new paleographers, because one of the main things that I learned during my epigraphy class is quite obvious when you say it, but somebody has to say it first, is that the choice of font and script and layout very much depends on the surface and material of the actual stone that you have, whether it's marble, sandstone, limestone. Same for the quality of the papyrus and how the thread is woven. The ability to write in a certain way actually depends on the physical surface, which is not always pointed out to people. And again, images, examples explaining how that can vary and why some inscriptions or papyri or ostraka look the way they do, not because somebody didn't know how to write properly, but because they had a low quality papyrus, for example, which made them write with thicker lines or whatever just to make the text visible.
Thank you. We're more or less out of time, but if anyone wanted to add any final comments, please feel free to. If not, I'll thank all three of you again. One note there: some of the references from this session will be added to the session page, so keep an eye on that. We'll add a couple of extra bibliographical references, and we may revisit add some more links to the exercise in there as well. But other than that, next week is the final session of this semester's Sunoikisis Digital Classics program. That will be the second of two sessions on the R programming language for text analysis. So please join us for that. And thank you all. Simona, Yasmine, Isabelle, again. Ciao.
Thank you.